Welcome to the Eric Osmos studio, where Nicholas Mazuki joins us today. Hello, you are the Director of Naval Strategy and Wargaming at CESM, the Center for Naval Studies and Strategy. And today we're going to think about the future of naval forces, of embarked air forces. That's right?
That's correct.
That's your main subject of study?
So it's one of my subjects of study. Indeed, the issue of the proliferation of naval air forces. Since today it's clear that naval aviation is becoming more important within the ongoing naval rearmament we've seen in recent years.
So what's the difference between aircraft and light carriers?
So, aircraft carriers are divided into two categories. Those that have arresting wires and a ski jump ramp for takeoff. You can think of the Kuznetsov or the first Chinese aircraft carrier, the Liaoning. Those that have catapults and arresting wires, which allow planes to land. So, to stop them when they land, but also to launch them using either steam or electromagnetic catapults. And today we find two countries in this category, the United States and France, and soon a third one, China.
And then, for light carriers, there are no catapults or arresting wires at all.
We have a flat deck and aircraft take off and land only from this flat deck, without any assistance from the ship.
That means we can launch aircraft that are smaller and less effective. Is that usually the operational difference?
The difference is a matter of carrying capacity. We actually launch aircraft that are smaller, that carry less payload. Less payload in terms of effectors, less payload in terms of sensors, because there isn't that takeoff assistance capability in particular, which is provided by the catapult.
So in this case, however, there are many more countries that have this type of ship. We can think of the British, even countries like Thailand. Here, it's a capability that's much more widely distributed, exactly.
That doesn't mean, by the way, that they are mutually exclusive. That is to say, a country that has aircraft carriers, let's take the case of the United States, aircraft carriers, catapults, and arresting wires, can just as well have amphibious assault ships. That's the case, for example, in the U.S. Marine Corps.
Yes, they're lucky to have a bit of everything. A quick question about drone integration. We also see that there are a number of countries that are starting to ask themselves the question because they can't manage to have real aircraft carriers or helicopter carriers. I'm thinking in particular of the Turks, who are looking into building drone carriers, right? That counts too.
Turkey counts as well. We can also think of Portugal, which has also announced a program for drone carriers specifically for aerial drones. Indeed, that counts too. The next question will be to see what these drones will be capable of in terms of range, in terms of payload capacity. But also, and this is where the difference will be, and the big question that will arise is about resistance, especially resistance to electromagnetic jamming, since from the moment the aircraft no longer carries a pilot, where the pilot is remote, or when the aircraft has autonomy. Obviously, there are different vulnerabilities that will open up.
So the Turks, in this case, it's more in the Bayraktar category, so these are small drones of 500 to 700 kilograms. We're not like the Americans, with real combat drones like the Stingray.
So for now, no, even though there are jet drone development programs. So it's the Kizilelma, especially for Turkey, that should take over in principle on the Anadolu aircraft carrier. Today, we're thinking about the TB2, the TB3 maybe. Tomorrow we'll have this drone, we'll have to see how it turns out. Today, there are still a number of technological barriers, especially in the United States. We also saw that the development of the Stingray was initially planned to be a combat drone, to be an aerial combat drone, a UCAV. But the evolution of the program, and actually the operational testing of a number of capabilities, showed that the step was too difficult to take all at once. And so this program has evolved to be today, not even a reconnaissance drone, but an aerial refueling drone. That doesn't mean we won't have combat or catapult launch drones tomorrow. The Stingray was originally meant to be that. Nevertheless, today we've realized that the technological and doctrinal difficulties have ultimately led to it being just an aerial refueling drone.
And let's remember that the missions, especially for the F-18, almost a third of the takeoff missions from the aircraft carrier are to serve as a nanny for the planes behind, and it's the same for the Rafale, by the way. So this type of drone would allow the carrier-based aircraft to preserve their potential and carry out real missions.
Exactly. And actually, the U.S. Navy relies heavily on the versatility of the F-18 on its extremely important weapons carrying capacity, which can carry additional armaments, which are very varied depending on the different types of missions. And indeed, the fact that the program, which was originally called Cutlass, led to the Stingray. The fact that this program did not result in a combat drone led to, instead of abandoning the program, actually making a sort of stopgap and saying, no, we can salvage it, precisely with this particular interest, which was to do refueling in order to save F-18, potential for other missions.
So I have one final question about dronification. Does that count? When the Ukrainians have naval drones launching small aerial drones, does that count? Like an aircraft carrier
It could count as, but at that point it would be the same as asking if we count the helicopter on board a frigate as naval aviation. The answer is yes, but it's not the same naval aviation, obviously, as when we think of a carrier air group, like for example the air group on board the Charles de Gaulle, where you'll find Rafales, where you'll find Hawkeyes, where you'll find a variety of aircraft capable of carrying out relatively different missions. In reality, it all depends on the mission assigned. If I go back to my example of the frigate, we realize that the frigate-helicopter combination qualifies as naval aviation. For this helicopter, it has a very specific mission, which is anti-submarine warfare. So yes, we can talk about it too, but mind you, it's not the same thing. We're not exactly in the same category.
We'll stick to those with fixed wings. In that case, we understand that there is still a range of potential missions, from almost nothing up to practically nuclear strikes. If we're talking about the Rafale specifically, what are the different doctrines and maybe the doctrine equipment combinations that we can already see in countries close to us? I'm focusing on NATO countries first, then we'll consider the adversaries.
So there are two main categories which actually go along with the two main categories of ships and embarked air groups. The first main category is, let's say, the more comprehensive category, the ability to carry out a wide variety of missions, ranging from aerial reconnaissance to deep strike. Potentially, in the case of France, even to deep nuclear strike. And here we find the United States, and mainly France, demonstrating the value of having catapult-equipped aircraft carriers. Today, France uses steam. Tomorrow, it'll be electromagnetic, as it already is in the United States. It will allow carrying aircraft that are relatively heavy with a lot of payload. It will allow the integration of early warning and airborne control aircraft into the embarked air group. These are the Hawkeye today. And so it will actually allow us to create what we call a limited naval air hypersuperiority bubble within the operational range of all these aircraft. So the strike aircraft and the airborne early warning and control aircraft, which will actually allow us to project power very far forward and deep into enemy territory. So here we have the United States, France.
So here it means that simply not having a catapult already prevents a country like Great Britain from having this early warning capability. They can't see beyond 300 kilometers with these aircraft's radars.
So they have an onboard early warning system today, but it's mounted on helicopters. So with a much lower speed and especially much weaker radar and control capabilities today. For example, if we take the case of British naval aviation, its early warning part is handled by the RAF, so it's not done within the Royal Navy, which actually requires at that point having a combination between the air forces, which is much more complex to coordinate, and therefore also potentially changes the freedom of action. Down below,
moreover, they necessarily have to start from the ground, exactly.
It's a bit complicated, and their range is actually more limited relative to the coast, though some can refuel in flight. So that's, let's say, the first group, meaning the more comprehensive group, which goes as far as deep strikes, including penetrating A2, AD bubbles, because that's also where we'll find the most complex missions to carry out. And on the other side, we'll have a bit of the British doctrine that we saw in the Falklands, since the current British doctrine is somewhat the heir to the one from the Falklands. We'll have planes that are meant for CAP, which means combat air patrol. So the main idea will be to carry out missions, air-to-air missions to guard against the adversary's carrier strike capabilities, precisely to protect the naval force as a whole and allow it, both surface ships and submarines, to deliver their effects. So for the British, let's say the aircraft carrier is mainly designed for a defensive protection role, and it's the rest of the force that delivers the effects.
All right, so potentially, actually they have bad memories of the Falklands with the Super-Étendard, the Exocet missile duo. And is this British doctrine still the same for all the other allied countries that have aircraft carriers, just simple aircraft carriers?
It's not the same, but if you look at the aircraft carriers and their aircraft, especially the F-35s with short takeoff and vertical landing, there are differences. They have a carrying capacity and a range capability that are quite unique. Just to give you an idea, the carrying capacity and the range capability without in-flight refueling of the F-35 with short takeoff and vertical landing, it is half that of the Rafale, so the Rafale goes twice as far while carrying twice as much payload.
Okay, now if we look at the other side, then the Russians, I want to say the Kuznetsov, after all the problems it has had, it will not return to sea.
There's very little chance. That would mean a colossal effort focused on a single ship, which, by the way, has always had problems throughout its operational history. We saw this during their last deployments in Syria, when they had to base planes on land. So for them, it's still something that's very complex to manage, extremely costly, And for results that, ultimately, when we look at Russian maritime doctrine today, the latest revision that was made, we realize that this isn't necessarily the focus of their use of force. Naval aviation is structured around a carrier strike group, knowing that the Russians have never used their aircraft carriers in a carrier strike group, designed, let's say, a bit like the French or the Americans.
See, was it due to limited technical capacity to produce it, or did they think it wasn't relevant from the start?
So from the beginning, they thought it wasn't relevant. There was a whole long history in the USSR about whether basically the aircraft carrier was a relevant tool for the USSR and then therefore for Russia. There was a whole ideology surrounding the aircraft carrier as the weapon of imperialism, the weapon of aggression. And so for a very long time, even when the USSR had, starting in the 1970s, aircraft carrier capabilities, the aircraft carriers were never called that. They were called anti-submarine cruisers. Precisely to avoid that term, to avoid the term aircraft carrier, which was already extremely loaded. So we realized that there was this kind of Soviet ideological bloc, and on top of that, there was a rather unique understanding of the role of the aircraft carrier. From the moment it entered service at the end of the USSR. There too, with a vision that was sometimes a bit connected to anti-submarine warfare, so not really a vision related to deep strike, or very little to deep strike, as was more the case on the NATO side. Russia has always struggled to define itself in this area, never truly finding its doctrine of use. And moreover, operationally speaking, they've never had a carrier strike group as it exists today, conceived in the French model, the American model, or the British model. Because this question of coordination between the different assets in the three dimensions, that is air, surface, and undersea, since a carrier strike group is made up of assets. In these three dimensions, it's a limited capability that needs extensive training and significant investment in both human resources and technology. Having an aircraft carrier, an aviation ship, and some surface ships doesn't automatically make a carrier strike group today.
But it's also because these resources, which are very important to have a real carrier strike group, require nuclear submarines, air defense, refueling ships. In short, it's really a comprehensive system. Russia no longer had the means to keep up and have that operational capability.
So it no longer had the means, and also it didn't want to. It wasn't part of its doctrine, the naval doctrine of the USSR and then of Russia. It's a doctrine of bastioning. It's a doctrine of area denial. It's actually a doctrine of preventing the other side from coming to attack you and stopping the other side from coming to attack you. In the Soviet-Russian view, let's say, this relied on two tools. It relied on the attack submarine, most of the time nuclear-powered, and on the other side, the long-range bomber aircraft carrying anti-ship missiles, especially the Tupolev 22. So there was a bit of this neglect, in quotes if I may say so, of the surface ship, which was considered more in a relatively coastal role, except in a few very specific cases, notably the case of the Kirov-class nuclear cruisers. But the aircraft carrier and the carrier strike group did not have their place within that structure. And in addition, you also have to consider the little squabbles and disputes that existed between the Soviet, then Russian Air Force and the Navy, also Soviet and then Russian, when it comes to the question of whether sailors should have fighter jets taking off from a ship.
And what about China, which is more or less the heir of the USSR and Russia, first of all? By the way, materially, by recovering the Soviet ships they didn't finish, if we stick to this vision today, does that mean no expeditionary missions for our aircraft carriers?
Well, they have been. We can consider it that way, or at least from what we can see, I would say, up until this year. Why? Because today, in 2025, we're undergoing a transformation. For now, it's about capabilities. We'll see later about doctrine, operations, and so on. But at the very least, it's about capabilities. The strength of Chinese naval aviation is marked by the entry into service of 3 new platforms, one in 2024 and 2 in 2025. In 2024, the aircraft carrier Fujian enters service, the first Chinese aircraft carrier to be equipped with catapults. Electromagnetic, regardless of the technology, but in any case, catapults and arresting wires. So the ability to have relatively large aircraft with long range and many sensors and effectors. And in this field, this time, of carrier-based aircraft, they will enter service in 2025. At the same time, the KJ-600, which is the Chinese equivalent of the Hawkeye, a carrier-based airborne early warning and control aircraft. And on the other side, the J-15D, which is the carrier-based offensive electronic warfare aircraft, the equivalent of the EF-18 Growler that the U.S. Navy has. So here we can see that just with the introduction of this equipment, The Chinese naval aviation is going to, in its use and design, and once again we'll have to see the deployments that come with it, probably getting closer to the US Navy or the French Navy.
So equipment at first and doctrine second.
That's it, and we'll have to see. And that's the big unknown today. What is China's ability to operate a carrier strike group? Meaning beyond just stacking up surface ships, planes, and submarines, are they able to make them work together? In what way and how effectively?
Typically the kind of power projection we've seen in the French Navy today, do we see China saying, I'm going to project power into the Pacific for weeks and months at a time?
It's quite clear that the carrier strike group, when we look at it, I mentioned this ability to project a bubble of localized hypersuperiority. In reality, in terms of naval strategy, if we have to sum it up, it comes down to just one thing. I have a carrier strike group. I'm able to impose on the adversary the place and time of the battle, and in fact, that's the usefulness of the carrier strike group. Because I project a bubble of hypersuperiority, I pose a threat that my adversary cannot ignore.
And so, if we look ahead 5 or 10 years, if they have a second or third aircraft carrier with arresting gear and catapults, can we estimate that there will be local Chinese superiority, for example, around Taiwan? Do we have any idea about the timeline?
So, first of all, in terms of strategy, China has no interest in using aircraft carriers or a carrier strike group. Around Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait is relatively narrow, and the ability to reach Taiwan, and even to reach beyond Taiwan. If we had naval forces that didn't actually enter the Formosa Strait, it's entirely possible to do it from land. So again, there is no advantage in using naval aviation to do that. If naval aviation were to be used in this context, it would most likely be used to send carrier strike groups. If they exist at all, if they are well established, and so on. Far away to pose a strategic dilemma to the adversary by telling them that my main point of support for the force, obviously it's going to be Taiwan. But you won't be able to ignore the fact that there will be a carrier strike group near Hawaii in the South Pacific, around the Aleutian Islands, in the Indian Ocean. And so, at the very least, it will force them to mobilize forces to deal with this threat, prevent it from acting, prevent it from causing harm, control it, and so on. Dilute their ability to concentrate. Today, once again, if we think about a Taiwan scenario, the main thing we can imagine, again, we're speculating here. Today we have no certainty. It's precisely this ability to create a strategic dilemma.
This means other countries in the region, not just the United States, must also question their ability to respond. I'm thinking of India first, but also Japan, which has the ability to convert its helicopter carriers into F-35 carriers. How are neighboring countries responding?
Exactly. Today, once again, we're talking about naval rearmament. It's a naval rearmament that's happening in all dimensions, under the sea, on the surface, and also in naval aviation. And today, we can indeed see Japan wanting to and being able to acquire its own naval aviation capabilities. Once again, the point is that the best response to naval aviation isn't necessarily naval aviation. There are other ways to respond. Today, the best way to attack an aircraft carrier, if I'm just talking about the ship itself, is the submarine. And it will most likely remain the submarine because of its stealth, its ability to approach silently, and the extremely severe damage that can be caused by torpedoes. So here as well, if there's a proliferation of submarines, it's also a response to the proliferation of naval aviation. In this case, we can't separate technical and operational variables from naval issues since everything is interconnected. We need frigates for air defense, and we need aircraft to project superiority at a distance. We need submarines to potentially attack and defend our own aircraft carriers, so it's really an entire system that works together.
And when you look at an aircraft carrier, incidentally, there's more money invested in the planes than in the carrier itself. So it's true that we talk a lot about the ship, but the capability of the planes that go with it, on the Chinese side as well, like the J-35, those things, do we have information about their capabilities?
Currently, no, everything is still very preliminary since these planes are just entering service. We'll have to see what deployments happen. How will they behave? How will they interact with each other in complex mission environments, in training scenarios that aren't easy training scenarios? So then, we'll be able to start getting data about that. For now, that's not the case today. We're still very much in the early stages in how we're approaching these topics. On the other hand, what we're seeing is a development that is, at first glance, qualitative, but above all, extremely massive in terms of quantity and where. That really leads us to ask a lot of questions about the future capabilities of competitors.
So I'll stay in the Pacific region. Now, if we look at India, India has its aircraft carrier without a catapult, but it's going to have Rafale jets.
There.
It's the same doctrine, but focused on Pakistan.
So it's a doctrine that, let's say, is focused on the Indian Ocean. It's clear that the area where India wants to assert its ability to intervene, wants to assert its capability, ultimately to be a great power. It's above all the Indian Ocean. The issue with Pakistan is the same. It's a bit like when we talked about China and Taiwan in the same way. We're talking about a relatively short distance. We're dealing with countries that share a common border. Naval power, especially when you look at the Pakistani Navy, is not the most appropriate tool to carry out missions in that area. There. In this case, the Indian Air Force is strong, powerful, and has proven its capabilities. It doesn't need, in addition, a Naval Aviation Force, where it's just an addition of capabilities. But it's not, let's say, a major change in terms of operational possibilities.
All right, let's put ourselves in 2050. In 2050, only one European aircraft carrier, a French one. We don't see any others.
Presumably, yes, there will be others.
There will be more STOVL carriers, though.
Not necessarily more than today, since we already have several STOVL carriers. In Europe, for example, there are 2 British and 2 Italian.
The Spanish.
The Spanish, potentially the Portuguese drone carrier we talked about. Some countries are thinking about strengthening their naval aviation capabilities, not necessarily on ships. For example, we could potentially think of Germany, potentially the Netherlands. So we won't necessarily have a lot more ships, but we already have a significant force. Today,
the United States still has 12 giant aircraft carriers and an entire fleet, possibly around 20 heavy aircraft carrying ships.
At first glance, yes. When it comes to linear trajectories, after 2050 it's both near and far. In terms of technology, we can see roughly what there will be. But there are also doctrinal constraints, political constraints, budgetary constraints, but also strategic constraints. Which means that for now, we can imagine trends, but will there be disruptions in the meantime that will shake up these trends? That's very likely.
And so, as a result, the area where things are changing the most is Asia, the Asia-Pacific as always.
The Indo-Pacific, that's where we see today, right now, this major dynamic of naval rearmament. That's where it's ultimately the most significant, with a hyper-focus on the Northeast Asia area, China, South Korea, Japan. But we still need to look at the entire Indo-Pacific region as well. We talked about India, which we can't forget, but also ultimately when we look at it, not necessarily aiming to acquire naval aviation capabilities, but we discussed Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean region. We should still remember that Egypt, in this case as well, bought the former projection and command ships, now French amphibious helicopter carriers. So that's also potentially a form of naval aviation. So we could also have surprises regarding the proliferation of these capabilities outside of this large Indo-Pacific area, or even Asia-Pacific Northeast Asia, which itself is relatively limited.
Strong growth is assured in the Asia-Pacific and possibly in other smaller countries too. Is this a destabilizing factor, or is it ultimately a stabilizing factor once you acquire this kind of high-end equipment?
Neither one nor the other. In reality, it's not necessarily the question of equipment that will determine the political conduct of the actors, but rather it's also a matter of leveling the strategic playing field. That is to say, from the moment the club expands, the ability to carry out complex operations also expands. So, potentially, if this capability develops among our allies, that's very good for us. If it develops among our competitors, then we need to ask ourselves some questions.
Nicholas, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon at the Air It Cosmos studio.